Hey, hello everybody. I thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We're really happy to see you out here braving the weather for this great event. So thank you so much for joining us. We at Left Bank Books are delighted to welcome Tom Mitchell, professor and editor of the new collection, Early Stories by Tennessee Williams. A couple notes before we begin. Tonight's event is only possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into our local economy. So it funds our streets, parks, everything else that makes St. Louis great. So thank you so much for helping us give writers the support they deserve, producing events such as this, and for shopping local and supporting this event. So thank you. We are delighted to present tonight's event in partnership with Tennessee Williams St. Louis. Since 2016, Tennessee Williams St. Louis has celebrated Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Tennessee Williams with an 11-day summer theater festival, as well as a scholars conference. And this year they're celebrating their 10th anniversary with their 10 for 10 event series, which tonight's event is part of as a presentation. So you can find more information about their work, the festival, and the other events they've got coming up at TWSTL.org. And this is also an exciting event for everyone at TWSTL because their advisory board member, Thomas Keith, served as a contributor to this volume. So we're really happy to celebrate him tonight as well.
Oh, yeah.
So Tom Mitchell is Professor Emeritus of Theater at the University of Illinois and Scholar in Residence for the Tennessee Williams Festival in St. Louis. Among other work, he edited The Caterpillar Dogs and Other Early Stories by Tennessee Williams. And his new published work is Early Stories by Tennessee Williams, an edited collection of 30 previously unpublished short stories written during the 1930s, when Tennessee Williams was living in the Midwest during a tumultuous period for the nation and himself. These stories highlight aspects of his biography relative to his young adult years that he spent in St. Louis, Columbia, and the Missouri Ozarks, and offers insight into the relationships between the author, his family, and close friends. The influence of proletarian fiction and leftist ideas are evident in Williams' stories, such stories of the Great Depression, and there are themes of his sexual identity, turmoil, and inner passions, inspired by authors like D.H. Lawrence. Throughout this volume, the notes are in for each story, add additional context, providing information on locations, occupations, and individuals referenced within. So it's full of enriching details that provide critical understanding of Tennessee Williams' major works. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Tom Mitchell to discuss his new book, Early Stories of Tennessee Williams.
And I'm very grateful to Left Bank Books for hosting us. And of course, we're doing this together with the Tennessee Williams St. Louis. We've had a great long relationship, and actually the festival has been the home for some of the adaptations of these stories. So we've tested out stories that ended up in this book over these past several years. Carrie Houck is here. Carrie, would you like to just say a little bit about these cards and the events?
Yes, I think that he covered so much, but I'm going to tell you that you have a little info card here. Our tickets went live yesterday, April 1st, and it's our 10th year. I think we do excellent work. The Scholars Conference has become nationally known. Tom Mitchell is, you're short selling yourself. He's our resident, I can't say resident scholar because he doesn't live here. He is our official Tennessee Williams scholar and a good friend. And I encourage you to come. Producing small theater is hard. The small professional theater is very difficult these days, and we need your support. Spread the word in the community. Again, our standards are pretty high, and we want to encourage live theater with every age group and in the city, and just get your friends in there and family in there and students in there, and check out the events. They're all on our website, and we'll see you along the way. I mean, this is one of many events we're doing this year, but our main festival is in August. So keep the dates.
Great.
Thank you.
It seems absolutely appropriate that we're doing this book launch event here in the heart of the Central West End. There are a number of the stories in this book that are set very close to this very location. And I'll talk about that just a little bit more. The stories in this collection that were written in the 1930s are all focused on St. Louis, Columbia, where Williams went to college, and the Missouri Ozarks, including Branson. He mentions Branson in those stories. And I thought a very good way to introduce things to begin with is for you to hear one of those stories. So I used this as an excuse to get two of my favorite actors together. My wife, Joy Hoffsummer, and Anna Pileggi, who is a director, an actor, and an acting teacher at WashU here in St. Louis. We don't get to work. We haven't worked together for many, many years, but this is an excuse. They're going to read a story to get us to sort of kick things off, a story called Till One or the Other Gets Back. And it is a dark, sort of a dark tale of the Ozark woods. And I thought it would be good to hear that because this is sort of dark and gloomy, not gloomy, it's a dark and suspenseful tale, appropriate for a stormy night like this. But also it gives you an idea of how these stories are different than the Tennessee Williams that you probably think you know. So let's not waste any time. Let's hear that story.
Yes, it's good. Yes, yeah.
She was a woman of the hills, born and bred. Her face was a smooth, pale yellow, like rich milk, and her deep-set eyes were flashing blue like the sky seen between the tops of tall cedars. Her face was drawn so sparely that the beauty of it did not come out until you caught it unawares, like a shy, perfect animal, hidden among leaves its own color. Her body was still more thinly chiseled, the breasts standing out like wooden knobs, and the flanks lean and attenuated, like the flanks of a running hound.
There was something about her, swift and elusive and subtle, that excited and frustrated desire, that was like seawater to the lips of thirsty men. You wanted to lay your hands on her flesh, but when you caught her and held her, there was nothing there but the hardness of sinew and skin and bone. You released her with a feeling of sick impotence, and then instantly caught hold of her again with the water dripping from your lips. She was such a woman.
She stood now at the door of the house looking out, her lean, saturnine face outlined against blue dusk. It was toward winter, and dry leaves swept in the door around her and rattled across the bare pine floor. She slammed the door shut and pushed her hands down her lean sides and looked into nothing for a moment or two. Then she opened her narrow lips and called,
"Get ready, Bill. Long about this time you might be starting back."
Her long fingers fluttered along her cheeks and coiled brown hair in a manner that was anomalously feminine.
"Bring down your gun," she yelled more sharply. "I'll fetch them lanterns from the barn."
The man came lumbering heavily down the stairs. He wore high boots. His big form moved woodenly, and the butt of his double-barreled gun trailed along the steps with a clanking that made the woman stiffen.
"Can't you tote that gun?" she hissed.
The man's eyes looked uncommonly large and pale in his narrow brown face, and his yellow hair hung over his forehead. With a startled movement, he hoisted the gun to his shoulder and then stood, waiting as though unable to stir without her command.
"Don't stand there like a stick," she yelled. "Get moving."
She stood, bristling a moment, then darted toward the rear of the house. The man glanced around him like a frightened animal. as though he were seeking some less perilous means of egress than the dark doorway which the woman had taken. But there was apparently no other way out.
Shortly afterwards, the man and the woman climbed onto the high front seat of an old Ford parked behind the house. The woman carried 2 lanterns and a can of coal oil.
The man carried his gun. They drove a piece down the Missouri State Highway, and then they stopped. Before them was that sharp turn in the road, which was locally known as Dead Man's Curve. The woman scrambled immediately out of the car and stood at the side of the road.
Get the car out of sight, she commanded. We ain't got nary a moment to lose.
Aw, hell, the man growled weakly. He'd be too all-fired drunk to see kingdom come.
Maybe you can take chances, she said, the woman muttered.
She retreated among the brush that grew along the field's edge and groped around till she found an old stump directly above the low embankment. She seated herself upon it, but found it too rough. She got up and spread over it her man's leather jacket, which was much too large for her own slender shoulders. She seated herself again, removed some cartridges from the pocket of her raveled brown sweater, and started loading the gun with thoughtless precision.
In a few minutes, the man joined her there. He seemed uncertain of what to do with his big wooden body. Sit down, she commanded.
Good sight from here? He asked, setting himself down awkwardly at her feet. She nodded her head and turned sharply away from him. She stared down the embankment toward the highway and Dead Man's Curve.
He might be long most any time now.
The man shifted uneasily on his haunches. Should have brought 2 guns.
2 guns, the woman sniffed. What for? I'll drop him all right.
They glanced at each other for a second, the woman's lips slightly sneering, the man trying nervously to smile. He looked away first and started to draw a pint bottle from the hip of his corduroy breeches.
Nah, you don't, the woman snarled quickly. She snatched the bottle from his hands and flung it onto the highway.
Oh, Mary, the man complained. It was like the whine of a punished dog.
The man and the woman settled down for their wait. About an hour later, the snow started falling in big, soft flakes. The woman never changed her position on the stump, but the man moved closer, leaned his shoulder tentatively against her knee. Instantly, the woman's tense figure relaxed.
She bent over to kiss him. The man made a gurgling sound in his throat and reached up with long, snake-like fingers. The woman pushed him away.
I seen you was scared, she mocked, when you come a-trailing that gun down the stair. When a man don't heft his gun to his shoulder.
This here's my first time for killing a man, he answered slowly. And him, my twin brother.
The woman laughed. You ought to thought of that first time you laid hold of me down in the field. A woman can't live in one house with 2 men. Leastwise, it ain't safe.
Sometimes, said the man, I think that you hate Clyde because he loves you a little less than you love him.
The woman laughed. Don't you try figuring me out now, Billy. Only God can do that.
God or the devil, he said, embracing her legs with his arms until they hurt. The woman suddenly clasped his shoulders with both hands and bent down to his ear.
I'd rather it was you, she whispered. It kept me warm in bed tonight.
They waited another hour.
Must have found him a woman up there, she said bitterly. But he'll be back before sunup.
The man's fingers raised up again like the heads of snakes from a charmer's basket when the music is played. They groped blindly toward the woman's body.
Your fingers are cold, she muttered without moving.
The man caught hold of her thighs. What made you cry when you seen him in town with Jess Turner that time? The woman stiffened. How come you cry all the way home? He persisted.
You talk too much about things that don't concern you, hissed the woman. If you don't shut up about Jess, I'll brain you, Billy.
The snow fell heavier and whirled in a keen wind. The woman lifted her reefer from the stump and wrapped it tight round her breasts, but still her teeth chattered.
That's right, Jess, she muttered. Keep him long as you can this time. It'll be a cold night before you see him again.
Get up, the man suddenly commanded. The woman shivering and the broken tone of her voice seemed to have given him a new kind of strength. He grasped the woman's elbows and jerked her up from the stump and sucked fiercely at her lips. Now, go on back to the house. I'll finish this job. The woman glared at him a long time through the blurring snow. Then she reached her hands up to his shoulders and pulled him down for another kiss. Go on back and keep the bed warm till I come, the man said.
There's more than one shot in that gun, she said meaningly. But there's only room for one man in my house from now on.
The woman started slowly down the embankment, clinging from tree to tree, with the black reefer whipping behind her. At the bottom, she spoke aloud once more, and without turning, as though she spoke to herself.
It'll be pretty cold in that bed till one or the other gets back.
The man swore under his breath. For 2 hours, lying in bed, she strained her ears for the sound of a gun down the road. But the wind blew so fiercely now that she couldn't have heard. Once she crawled out of bed and opened the window. At Dead Man's Curve, she could see the 2 lanterns flickering faintly in the middle of the road. Apparently, nothing had happened, time seeming to have struck a snag that night. She slammed the window down hard and got back into bed. With every moment, the cold seemed to grow more intense, and her body shuddered uncontrollably between the coarse sheets.
Short while later, she heard the door thrown open below. Without pause, the man's heavy footsteps went down the hall, started up the stairs. The footsteps were neither hurried nor slow. There was nothing about them, no individual accent to distinguish the steps of one from the other. She would have to wait for the returning man's voice to tell her which of the 2 had come back.
She lay with her eyes tight shut in the lightless room. She was mumbling a sort of formless prayer, and her fingers were clawing the sheets. Without pause, the steps came straight to the bedroom door. The door was pushed open. Then she knew. She knew by the sound of his breath and the faint odor of alcohol blown into the room's cold air which of the 2 brothers had come back. She bit her lips hard and waited. Her body seemed to shake the whole bed, and it was difficult to keep her breath from rasping in the aching cold void of her chest. The steps moved deliberately over to the little table. A match was struck, and a second later, the lamp flared up. Opening her eyes slowly, as if from sound sleep, she looked into her husband's alertly staring face.
Howdy, Clyde, she murmured sleepily. You're late.
The man unbuckled his reefer and dropped it to the floor. Been waiting up long? He said casually. But she saw him stand still for the answer, with his head slightly cocked. She waited a minute for her voice to settle down in her throat, and then she answered.
Nah, I just this moment woke up.
The man jerked into motion again, stripping off his flannel shirt and dropping it beside the reefer. Then he seemed to strike another physical hiatus. He leaned toward the woman. Did you hear anything a piece down the road?
When?
A few minutes ago. She put an irritable tone to her voice.
I told you, Clyde. I just now woke up.
He turned slowly away from her, scratching his chest. "Oh, some feller took a shot at me down by Dead Man's Curve. Double barrel gun. Went right through the windshield, missed my head, but I reckon by half an inch." Again, the woman met his eyes without perceptibly flinching. The man's eyes dropped first.
God Almighty, the woman exclaimed at last, as though the full import of this news had just sunk in.
The man grunted, turned over the slop pail, and sat down to remove his boots. "Two lanterns were setting out there in the middle of the road to stop me, I reckon. But I drove right through." He grunted again contemptuously. "Them that hunt squirrels best not cock their guns for a man." He tore the rest of his clothes off swiftly and came over to the bed. He sat down on the edge of it for a moment to rub his cold feet. Before she could seal her lips against it, the question thrust itself out.
"Only one shot?" she asked.
"No," he answered slowly. "Funny thing, come to think of it, seemed like I counted two. I heard the second. Guess when?
The woman was silent.
After I turned the car into the drive." He lowered his body toward her and buried his hands in the quilt, one on either side of her roundly outlined form. "I ain't seen Billy," said the man. "Where's Billy?" The woman's eyes blinked ever so slightly.
"He must be sleeping by now," she muttered. He must be sound asleep."
They stared at each other for long moments, and slowly they both began to smile. A faint blush crept into the woman's face. Her limbs twitched under the coarse sheets and the gaudy patchwork quilt.
"It's been cold in this bed," she purred softly, "waiting for you to get home."
Thanks. That was great. I imagine Tennessee across the street over there is smiling, having his story read here. I know Anna has to dash off because she's directing tonight, but I appreciate so much the two of you reading that story. So what I want to do is to tell you all a little bit more about this collection of stories, but I hope that this first example gives you an idea that this is not the Glass Menagerie. These stories are not that necessarily. They're not. This is not a different version of Streetcar Named Desire or Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, but they were. This is a collection of original stories that this young man, Thomas Lanier Williams, was writing when he was living in St. Louis. Sometimes working at the International Shoe Company downtown, and sometimes just living in his family's home and probably escaping the tensions in that home by escaping into the stories and the fictions in his mind. As I said, these stories, many of them are located like very close to here. And one of the first example, the first story, first full story in the book is called Apartment F, 3rd floor south. And that location, that apartment is at the Glass Menagerie apartment that is just a block and a half away from here. And if you look, it still has, there is still that apartment that is Apartment F, 3rd floor south. And it is as described in this story. I'll read you just the very first paragraph of that one. So he says, for about 10 minutes, the long glittering nose of his roadster had sniffed disdainfully up and down the narrow, unfamiliar streets before the young man named Chuck, was able to locate the address where the girl, Valerie, had printed on the sweatband of his straw hat last Saturday night. It was a 3-story apartment house of mustard-colored brick, and he thought, pretty sharp looking, as he sauntered up to the door. Above the top row of mailboxes was a small white card on which was printed Arthur B. Winston, Universal Insurance Company, Protection for All. Beneath this was scribbled in pencil, Apartment F, 3rd floor south. And that place is there today. That's the beginning of a story that is a depiction of a young man and his sister, something like Tom Williams and his sister Rose, living in an apartment, in this case with their father, who is sort of a lazy, sleeping, embarrassing presence on the couch when this young man, a member of the country club, drives over for a date with Valerie, the young woman. It is one of several stories that are inspired by Williams' own family. And among these stories, there are a number of them that fit into that category. We have stories that relate to Williams' mother, to his father, to his grandfather, who was an Episcopal minister from the South, but eventually retired up here to St. Louis. And also a story about his sister and a story about Tom himself, based on an observation of what he was like himself. It's interesting to see these because they're not the same. They are not the same kind of versions of that family that we see in Glass Menagerie and others. But because a lot of us are probably familiar with the Glass Menagerie, it gives you a chance to see those characters from a different angle and with a different perspective and different elements to their story. The other, another category of stories that are in this book are stories set in neighborhoods around St. Louis. So not just the Central West End part of the city, but stories that take place downtown, in other neighborhoods, different ethnic neighborhoods, and neighborhoods of different socioeconomic sort of status. And those were all, he is drawing pictures of what life was like in those areas, those parts of the city in the 1930s, of course, during the Great Depression. It is also really interesting to see how he observed those things and how well he describes what life was like in this city during that time. Because as I read them, I'm not a native, but an Illinoisan who comes over to visit. It's very interesting to be able to read how he describes things and compare how he describes life then to what we see today. Some of the neighborhoods, some of the life is similar. Some of the buildings are similar. Many of them are still there. And some of the circumstances, actually, especially the economic situation, some of the tensions in the city between ethnic groups and racial groups and socioeconomic groups, there are still similarities. And so to see them from his perspective then and to consider them from our perspective today is truly enlightening. He also, in these, there are also a range of characters who have occupations all over the city, different sorts of occupations. Of course, because Thomas Lanier Williams came back, his father took him out of the University of Missouri before he reached his senior year and made him go to work as a clerk in the International Shoe Company downtown. There are a number of stories that relate to his experience working as a clerk in that shoe company, which was a skyscraper in his time. A story called "Stair to the Roof" takes him up on the top of that building where he can get a little bit of fresh air during those years of terrible smog and pollution in St. Louis. And he would look out across the city, and even, I think, he was wishful thinking a little bit, but he could look over to the Illinois side of the river and imagine the trains on the Illinois side escaping from St. Louis and going north and south into the east and the west, and trying to imagine himself sort of free of this life in what he felt was a claustrophobic, oppressive office. He also depicts, of course, these other parts of not just St. Louis, but Missouri. He was a student at the University of Missouri in Columbia. And so a number of these stories relate to that life. How he observed that town, that college town in the middle of the state, far from the industrial home in St. Louis, but also in a community of other young people, and the young people of his time, of the 1930s. Many of those folks, the young people that he knew and he writes about in those stories, were of the generation that came after World War I. Sometimes their parents had served in that war, and certainly they had all experienced the terrors of that First World War. So as a generation, they were very much against militarism and against seeing their country go to war again. They were also, Williams started at the University of Missouri in 1929, the fall of 1929, so right when the stock market crashed. So they're looking at a time when their economic future, their professional futures were very much in doubt. It was unlikely that they would get jobs. And so, kind of like some of our generations today, unsure about what the future might hold, and especially upset by that. There were young people in this city marching in the streets on Skinker down by WashU in protest of what their government was doing, fearful of the government getting them involved in this new war that was brewing in Europe, fighting against the economic hardship that either they were feeling, their families were feeling, or those unemployed folks that they saw all around them in the city were feeling. And Williams was a friend of those politically active young people. And he writes about it with a lot of energy, a lot of passion. And it's not a Williams that we know very well. We don't think of him as a political playwright. But certainly during this time in the 1930s, he wears those politics on his sleeve in a number of these stories. Another of the things that we find in these stories is Tennessee Williams, Thomas Lanier Williams, preoccupation, curiosity with sex. So he's a young man, and he was still a virgin when he's writing these. Williams is a gay playwright, a gay writer, but in this time he had not yet come to terms with his own sexuality. He had not acted on his feelings, and I think was not even very clear about what he felt. But he was very much influenced by his family and society to say that he needed to find a young woman and settle down. And those feelings also that developed out of the jazz age, because he was a teenager in the 1920s, led to a lot of confusion. That confusion leads him to exploring sexuality in these stories, imagining what might happen. And so it's a fascinating look at sexuality by this young writer, and especially because we know where his career where his writing takes him. And he's always a writer who's provocative in the way that he talks about sexuality. But in these stories, it is surprising the places he goes. And you'll find that in the stories. You'll also find it in a wonderful essay by my friend and a friend of the Tennessee Williams St. Louis, Thomas Keith, who is another Williams scholar who has also edited works by Williams, especially the short plays by Williams. And he writes about the sexuality in these early works of Williams. Thomas Keith is a writer who's also edited the works of contemporary gay writers in New York. And he brings the sensibility of today's thoughts about sexuality together with his familiarity with who Williams was and what he was writing. And the combination really opens up some, I think, different avenues, different perspectives for us as you read these stories. Finally, in this group of stories, what I think is interesting is that Williams, this young man in his 20s, is writing about life and death and the meaning of life in a very major way. Now, in some ways, it surprises me because he's in his 20s. He's a young man. He's not facing death himself, and had not really been. He had not had a lot of very close experiences with deaths in his family, even at the point when he was writing these. But on the other hand, it doesn't surprise me because he is a writer always throughout his whole career, who explores that topic of what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to have a career? What does it mean to face death? And how does that define a life? And so in a number of these stories, he takes those topics head on and explores them in very mature and provocative sorts of ways. So altogether, these are 30 works, 30 stories that have never been published before. They exist mostly in the collection of Tennessee Williams papers at the University of Texas at Austin, where he placed his papers later in his career, with the feeling that he wanted those to be someplace so scholars would be able to look at his works, so that young people would be able to see how he wrote and think about that. And I felt it was very important to get this work out. Scholars have known about a lot of these stories, but the general public doesn't. And even scholars have not. It's not easy to get your hands on those works at Texas. So I think you will be among the first to read this work by a writer with whom you're probably very familiar. And I guarantee you will be surprised by the other things that he was writing about. These are 30 stories. When I put these together with the idea that they would, the title that I proposed was Missouri Stories by Tennessee Williams. Now, when I got the University of Iowa as a publisher for it, they said, I don't think we want to call it Missouri Stories. So the more general title, Early Stories by Tennessee Williams, is still appropriate. But I'll tell you that these are all they're local stories and certainly Missouri stories. And I think that in particular, you will find these meaningful because of your familiarity with the place. This is not all of the unpublished stories. There are many more. And as I dig into those stories, I'm always pleasantly surprised, that he goes places I would never guess. And I think hopefully in years to come, we'll see some more collections of Williams stories. I think that they're fun to read, they're intriguing, they're thoughtful, and they're provocative. And I hope that you find the same as you encounter the stories. I think we'll take a little bit of time to answer any questions you have about this or about this reading that you heard. Yeah.
Why University of Texas and Austin for this paper?
Because, you know, it was right at a time that Texas, the University of Texas, decided, they made a strategic plan to invest in the papers of writers, of American writers, dramatists, and also screenwriters and movie makers. And so they were at the beginning of that process, and he was at a place in his career where he had a lot of stuff to get rid of. So it was a happy combination.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, there some of those are also at Harvard, and Yale has some, and Columbia has some, but especially these early works, Texas has the best collection.
What is at the University of the South? How are they involved at
The
Swami?
University of the South has some things. His grandfather is a graduate of the University of the South. And actually they have a lot of his papers. They don't have as much of Tennessee's works. But there's
Some of the 1X though, the licensing goes back. Yes.
Yes, all the licensing goes back to the University of the South. Well, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about his transition from an author of short stories to the playwright?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that also was happening here right during that time. So he had gone to the University of Missouri and was majoring in journalism with the idea of becoming a writer. That's how you became a writer at that time. And he was really most interested in poetry, and he was writing poetry. He won a contest for his poetry at the Link Auditorium that's just up the street when he was at this age in his 20s. But he was also writing stories. And he was writing a few plays during his college years. He had what you might call a nervous breakdown working at the International Shoe Company, and decided he had to quit that job. He escaped down to Memphis, where his grandparents were living, and he stayed with them for a month or so. When he was down there, he met a young woman, and together they wrote a play, and they had that play produced in Memphis. He also met a friend of his grandfather's who was working on a longer play, and said that Williams could have that play and rework it and make whatever he wanted of it. He came back here, and because he wasn't working at the shoe company anymore, he dedicated his time to writing, including writing plays. And he worked with a little theater group, also producing their plays at the Link Auditorium. That was the Wednesday Club then. And they produced those early plays of his. So right away, around 1937, he had full-length plays produced by a company of fairly talented amateur actors. And the newspapers in town said, this is quite a talent. This young man has talent. And that kept him going. He eventually, shortly after that, by 1938, decided he was going to pursue playwriting and went to the University of Iowa. That was, at that time, probably the major playwriting program in the country for young writers, and finished his undergraduate degree there as a playwright. And the more and more he got, good responses to his playwriting, he tucked these stories that he'd written back away in his boxes and things, and put his energies into being a playwright. So that's sort of what was going on. He continued to write short stories, but he put his emphasis on that stage. Yes.
Do you see in these stories characters or themes that foreshadow what is in his later famous plays?
Oh yeah, I think absolutely. There, in particular, he writes often about the individual's need to escape from whatever kind of oppression he finds himself in. But for instance, that the story that I mentioned, Stair to the Roof, that's written about working in the shoe company. He expands that and takes it in a different direction in a play called Stairs to the Roof. But that's very much about a young man who has to get out of that office and eventually finds the way to escape. At the same time, there's another story about a clerk, a story called Corduroy Pants, that's about this young, sort of a young office worker who is in the park outside of the shoe company down there by the library downtown. They see each other, and the office worker envies the freedom that this young man, who's been riding the rails and sleeping in the park, the freedom that he has. He finally offers the young man everything. He gives him his wallet, his watch, his ring, everything, if that young man will just walk with him and talk to him. And then we learn that the office worker is going to
Don't give everything.
is going to do something.
Yes, don't give away the ending.
It's that. So that theme of escape shows up. I think also the themes, the strong female characters who express their sexual desires that we see in Cat o' Nat and Roof and Streetcar. Those same kinds of characters and that same kind of need is evident in a lot of these stories. Yeah.
I have a question from the virtual audience. If you were to give a Tennessee Williams tour of St. Louis based on this collection, what would be the highlights?
Oh, gosh.
Speaking of,
Yeah.
well,
We do a walking tour of the Central West End area.
which we will do this summer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I use little selections from these stories as examples of, that are drawn from the locations. And the same thing with some of the other places where Williams lived. He lived in University City, and there are places there that still exist that you can see how they inspired Williams.
And in the Demond High Point neighborhood, the family had
Their home.
one on Aberdeen, one on Arundel. I think they had a flat on Northwood at one time. And he references the Demond area in some short story, because he mentions the pharmacy, for those of you who are from here, Citran, he used to be on the corner. Doesn't mention it by name, but I know it's that.
Right. One of the things in all of these stories that is fun, I think, for me even, I'm not even from here, but he drops so many specific place names,
Yeah.
And addresses and references to stores or that sort
And
of
the
thing.
park.
Dan
the
McGuire is like the expert, and he's advised me on so much of this. But each of these stories is sort of, you'll see these kinds of things.
Since you mentioned Dan, may I talk about? There's going to be a map that we're putting on our website shortly of every Williams site in the city of St. Louis, and Dan has done all the research for that. So we're greatly appreciative.
Hopefully by BFS.
Yeah, yeah, it's a lot.
Is it to the Williams family like a change in fortune? You know, they went from a small apartment to Aberdeen, and what caused that?
Well, William's father was an executive. He was a sales manager in the shoe company. So he had a good job. And the longer he was here, that I'm sure that improved, that whole situation improved. But also the grandfather and grandmother from down south moved up and shared a home with them when they moved into the Clayton area. Yeah, so things changed. Williams was finally, he moved away from home to Iowa before they moved over there. So he lived in University City in a couple of places there.
But he does mention the house on, I think, Arundel, and I forget which number it is. But you see the room where he would write from in the front of the house.
Right, in both Aberdeen and
And Arundel, and wasn't there a house on Whiteout as well?
that was his
Yeah.
mom's house,
Yeah, that's,
and he lived over there. His room is up in the garage there.
Yeah.
Right across from the church.
One of the things too that I find is that reading these stories makes me do is to imagine a young writer at work, because we know something about his work from the big plays and the later work that he saw produced or made into movies. When you read these earlier works, you can see the ideas operating, and you can imagine him inspired or troubled, and how that comes out into a story. Any other
can you
questions?
mention some of the bigger title plays that did originate with some short stories?
Well,
Maybe not from this volume.
yeah, they aren't so much from this volume. But he had a couple of short story versions of elements that go into the Glass Menagerie. There's a short story called The Night of the Iguana that is like that play, but different from that play.
Mhm.
There's a story called Three Players at a Summer Game that is the beginnings of what becomes Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. So he was a writer who did that, who developed ideas, sometimes in short story form, and then took them into a play form. But also he would sometimes take them to a play form and then come back and write a story. Williams was a person who wrote compulsively. His routine was to get up and swim every day and then work at the typewriter and create a lot of work. So a lot of these, he would just knock out page after page after page, and revision of those pages, often not numbering any of them or keeping them in a very organized way. So as an editor, my job was often to take this jumble of pages and try to put them back together to see what's the story that he's writing, and in the various versions of how he wrote it, what seems to be the most effective version. So I've also in the book there's an introduction that explains a lot of this. Questions about how he becomes playwright and sets aside the short story writing. And also there are individual notes on each of the stories with details, sometimes about the locations in the city or what was going on at the time, or characters that relate to people in Williams' life. So if you are intrigued by a story, you can find out more about all of that through those notes. And this is not a particularly academic book. It's a book for general readers to enjoy those stories. But a general reader who has interest in the backgrounds of things and just may want to know more, hopefully that's what this will allow you to do. Great. Any other questions? Yeah.
He spent some time as a student at Washington University.
Mhm.
Are any of the stories about that time in his life?
There is a story that's called Byron, the Campus Poet. And it's about this young man. It's a story really where he pokes fun at himself for taking himself so serious. And he sees himself because the character, I must not tell you all of it, but the character got a lot of attention as a pre-college student because he won a contest for his writing. And so he's sure when he starts into college that everybody's going to love his work and look up to him. And he probably will win more contests. And that's not necessarily what happens to him, but that's one that's very much like that. And there's another that's set mostly really in Columbia, but about this group of students who are graduating and then move back to St. Louis. And that's also interesting to see, what, for those young people, what's that like, that transition? Great.
Can I just mention a couple of our events that where Tom will be talking more about Williams, but not necessarily. Well, the Missouri History event, which is Thursday, it's on the website in July, I believe, is specifically going to be about our not about our production, but about the play A Streetcar Named Desire. And we're collaborating with Upper Theater of St. Louis on that event. And the Missouri St. Louis County Library, the new branch, which is just spectacular, the new headquarters on Lindbergh, will be doing a big Williams festival kickoff on July 31st with various members of the company, the director of our production of Streetcar, and a few actors, and Tom will also be talking there as well. So check us out, buy your tickets. We're doing a festival pass for the first time this year. And it's a good bargain for those of you who come to everything. And I'm looking at you too. Yeah, so again, we need your support. Tell your friends. And buy the book. You can buy it tonight and Tom will sign it for you.
Yeah, and I will say the University of Iowa Press, it's really nicely made.
And a nice price.
It's a great price. This is the first time for 40 years. There have been no new Tennessee Williams stories published for 40 years. So this is the latest thing. Anyway, thanks very much. It's been great.
Thank you all so much. Sorry.
Actually, the Missouri History event is July 31st, the county library one. It's sometime. It's on the website. We'll figure it out tomorrow.
Thank you all so much for coming. Yes, we've got this book as well as some other of Tennessee Williams for sale up front, and then we'll get some books signed up here as well.
Yeah, is this where you want to do the
Yeah, we'll do it
signing?
at the table.
Okay.
And I'll move some stuff around.
Oh, and I want to thank Peter Shank for our artwork this year. He's sitting right here. Hot off the presses. Hot off the presses. It's a good one, right?
Yeah. Always, yeah.
Right.